Welcome to Rich Planet TV. I'm Richard D. Hall. I've covered the blatantly concocted so-called pandemic extensively in previous shows. Today's guest has documented the subject in a new book entitled Pseudopandemic, New Normal Technocracy. The scamdemic, as I like to call it, has nothing to do with the response to an alleged virus. It was and is, as we will show, an attempted coup d'etat for global power over humanity and the planet. We are going to discuss in some detail how and why the coup d'etat has been attempted, and perhaps get closer to who might be behind it. The book is a gripping exposition of political deceit. Built upon rigorous examination of the evidence, it explores the unthinkable and delivers a damning indictment of global corruption. It charges the reader to confront the stomach-churning reality. Once eyes are opened, they cannot look away. So welcome, Ian Davis.
Thank you very much, Richard. Pleasure to be here.
Okay. Now, some viewers might know that Ian is a researcher and helps the UK Column, which is an online news programme, which I have to say has been providing some much-needed coverage of what's going on throughout this pseudo-pandemic. Yeah. So how did you get involved with UK Column, Ian?
Well, I'm a blogger. I started my blog, I think it was about 2004, something like that, 2005. But then a few years ago, I was made redundant. And I took it upon myself then to do a bit of retraining, and I retrained as a journalist, and I've got a vocational qualification as a journalist. Mm-hmm. And then I sort of stepped up the output a bit more, and a few people picked up some of my articles, people like the Off Guardian and 21st Century Wire and James Corbett and people like that, and the UK Column. Mm-hmm. And they noticed, and I was a UK Column member as well. And they noticed some of and some other UK Column members were sharing the articles, and then UK Column. I've been very fortunate. They've they quite often print my stuff now and share my stuff, and you know, so I've been very lucky in that respect. Right.
Yeah, they often mention you in their programme. Now, in the introduction, you talk about inalienable rights. Which sort of sets the pretext for the book. So what is inalienable rights?
Well, inalienable, they're intrinsic to you. They can't be, they're immutable as well. They can't be changed. They are your rights. And the reason that I spoke about that in the introduction of the book is it's a theme that runs throughout the book, but it isn't overtly expressed. I think I touch on it a couple of times. But if we think about what's happened during the so-called pandemic, which I call a pseudo-pandemic or scamdemic, whatever you want to call it, the underlying theme of that has been the removal of our inalienable rights, which I would suggest differ very much from what we might call human rights. Human rights are written on pieces of paper by governments and by lawyers, and they're subject to change. They can be changed, and as we've seen during the pseudo-pandemic, we've seen that when it's convenient for governments to get rid of our so-called human rights, they either completely ignore them or just change them. We can see that when we look at the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. It expressly says that all rights within this that are declared are within this declaration, which by you can infer from that any rights that aren't in the declaration are not. They don't consider them to be rights. Whereas inalienable human rights, based on a system of, I would say, natural law, some people might choose to call that God's law or whatever, is basically our understanding of right and wrong. And it is something which we are always born with. We always, most people that have a normal emotional response, they intrinsically know right from wrong. We know, we feel it, we experience it as guilt when we do something wrong, and when we do something noble, we experience it as a sense of fulfillment. And this is an emotional response to right and wrong, and we all know what it is. I mean, I think any one of us that goes to that does something wrong, if we steal something, if we hurt somebody else, those of us with normal emotional responses react to that, and our inalienable rights are the things that we do are right. So whatever we do that is right is a right. And whatever we do that is wrong is not a right. So our inalienable rights could be expressed by the expression of do no harm, or do not cause loss or harm to others. And I feel that if we had a society where we genuinely lived by those rights, then we wouldn't be in the situation that we're in at the moment.
And would you say that those rights include the right to prevent someone doing harm to you?
Yes, no, I mean...
that comes in the take no shit, do no harm, take no shit side of it.
Yeah, I mean, we in fact, I'd say it was a duty to do that. Because if we all have human... we don't have human rights, we all have inalienable rights, and we all share those in equal measure. So your rights and my rights are the same. So if your rights are infringed, if someone infringes your rights, they are equally undermining my rights. So we have a duty to defend those rights. So we have and I mean, one of the problems that often comes when people talk about do no harm or cause no harm principle is, well, how do you defend those rights against an aggressor? But we have the right to self-defence, because it is a right. It's the right thing to do. So therefore it is right. But we cannot initiate any kind of causing anyone harm. So if on a very basic level, if someone is attacking me, physically perhaps, I have the right to defend myself with minimum force. If I use excessive force, that would be wrong. So I think we have to see it in that way. But if we're looking at it from a social perspective, when we are under attack, as we have been over the last 15 to 16 months, we have a right to defend ourselves against that. Now however, peaceably, lawfully. So we need to use all means, all peaceable means and all lawful means to defend ourselves against what is undoubtedly an attack by the government and the establishment.
Okay, all right. Well said, Ian. Now, throughout your book, you do refer to a lot of different organisations, quangos, governments, and what I did, I tried to draw that out in a chart, and then I passed it to Ian, who tidied it up a bit, and then has come up with this very interesting chart that I can put up on the screen. But we were just discussing this before the interview, explaining that it's not like a hard and fast political global structure. There's a lot of malleability within this, in that something like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we think, fits into a few of these different categories that we've got on the screen here. Do you just want to make a comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're looking at it from the flow of policy, so where does policy originate? Who leads on the formation of that policy? How is that policy passed down to us? Who enforces that policy? And what effect does that policy have on us? So if you look at it from, it's a higher, I would say it's a compartmentalised hierarchical structure. Mm-hmm. So at the top of that, we might have someone like the Bank of International Settlements, followed by central banks who are controlling the economy and the monetary system, mm-hmm. which gives them very much authority. They have authority over the whole system because they control finances, they control the financial system. And then below that, then we have organisations like the World Economic Forum, and then the think tanks. And I think the think tanks are really key because they formulate the policy. So they take, and this is when we're talking about it being malleable. Mm. Do the central banks tell the think tanks what policies to form? I think that's questionable. I think it's a two-way process. So there's negotiation and discussion and things that go on. And I would also say that people come in and out of. So one of the examples that we've included on the chart is the Club of Rome. Well, the Club of Rome has waned in its influence. You know, it's still you know, there are the Club of Madrid and places like that, but you know, other think tanks come to the fore. So you could argue that the World Economic Forum has been a policy think tank throughout the pseudo-pandemic, scamdemic.
And in this section along the top, most of these are either secret or semi-secret in their activities. Nobody can go and sit at Chatham House,
no,
or in a Rockefeller meeting.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things is they used the Chatham House rule. I mean, which is used across business and it's used across industry for private meetings where the information that's discussed in the meeting is not disclosed publicly. However, you know, one of the perhaps annoying things about when you're researching this kind of information is that the idea of the secret, you know, the secret conspiracy, whereas in fact these organisations publish policy documents that we can all read. You know, we can read the World Economic Forum's Great Reset documents. You know, we can read what the Council on Foreign Relations say about foreign policy. So it's not like, to that extent, you know, the things that perhaps you and I would talk about. Yeah. This is based on public domain information. Beyond that, because they use things like Chatham House, then you do have to kind of try and interpret that.
So just to summarise, what you're saying here is that the political structure that many people think exists and makes decisions about the lives in the UK is very different. The national government is merely a franchise or a franchisee of something that you call the Global Public-Private Partnership. So the Global Public-Private Partnership covers the whole world and includes national governments as franchisees of that Global Public-Private Partnership. So we'll talk about Global Public-Private Partnership a bit more as we go through. So here's a quote from Ian's book. I'm going to be reading a lot of quotes from Ian's book because we are going to get into it in some detail. He says that COVID-19 was a pseudo-pandemic. The threat level suggested by those running the psychological operation was a lie. It was a fraud designed to fool you into abandoning your inalienable rights and freedoms. The core conspirators' objective was to enable the reset of the global economy, the world's monetary system, and its political and social structure, simply to further their own interests. So I remember when it all kicked off, people were discussing if there is a hidden motive, what the hidden motive is. You've concluded that that's at least the prime motive.
Yeah, I think it serves many purposes. But I think primarily it's about the restructuring of the global financial and monetary system.
Right. And also planetary assets, which we're going to talk about as well.
Yeah, and this very much feeds into the climate change agenda, Agenda 2030, Agenda 21, you know, and how this restructuring of the economy will enable the seizure of the Earth's resources.
Right. All right. Now, you use various terms in your book. I'm just going to list some of them, and perhaps you can explain what you mean by them. You have the core conspirators. We've got informed influencers, deceived influencer, unwitting influencer, infodemic, plausible deniability, led by science, philanthropy, UK state franchise. So, core conspirator, what do you mean by that, Ian?
I would say these are the people that are perhaps at the top of the hierarchical authoritarian structure. So people perhaps within the Bank of International Settlements, perhaps within the Royal Institution of International Affairs, people that are very high up in the compartmentalised hierarchical authoritarian structure.
Right, and you think that the mass populace probably hasn't got a clue who they are?
No, and I think it's very difficult sometimes to know, because obviously they're not going to come out and admit it. But I mean, it's there are people that are familiar to us that we perhaps might say, yeah, they look like they're very high up in the structure.
All right. And informed influencer.
So around that group, there will be people that are needed to implement the policy. Now, some of those people, I would suggest, and you can certainly look at the statements of people like possibly Ghebreyesus from the World Health Organization, would need to have some idea what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they in order to be able to guide the policy effectively.
Mm-hmm.
So I wouldn't say that these are people that, and we were talking earlier about where would someone like Bill Gates or Klaus Schwab fit into that. And I think, as you were saying, I think these positions can change. Mm-hmm. Particularly Bill Gates, I would say that it looks like he's probably quite involved in policy formation, mm-hmm. but also he's a mouthpiece for policy delivery as well.
Right. So you think that some informed influencers are embedded in world governments?
I think most world governments. I mean, personally, I think that it would be unlikely that someone who isn't connected to the hierarchical structure would ever be a world leader.
Right.
So I don't see how they could be in. They wouldn't be allowed to that position of authority without that.
Perhaps apart from a few African countries like Tanzania and maybe Belarus or
yes,
or Haiti.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So we've got unwitting influencer.
Yeah. So I think you've got people. Around that group who are. So if we're looking at a crime, for example, somebody would have to have knowledge, and they would have to understand that they are misleading. So you might call that guilty mind, mens rea. You might say that they've got a guilty mind. But also there are other people that follow the policy, perhaps absolutely believe in the policy, but aren't aware of any kind of nefarious objective.
Yeah.
So they are. I wouldn't say useful idiots, but you might use that. You might use that analogy. So they are promoting the policy and doing so, believing in the policy and pushing the policy on the public, but they're not aware that there's a nefarious.
Because the whole thing becomes like a juggernaut. It has a massive amount of momentum because there's so many influential people pushing the same idea.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult for an unwitting influencer to suddenly have an attack of conscience and just go against the entire tide.
Yeah.
So they're just being swept up in the whole thing and perhaps not questioning things. And they perhaps they fool themselves. Who knows? Now, what about infodemic? What does that mean?
Well, the infodemic is what we're doing.
Yeah.
we are the infodemic.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, anyone that questioned it was obvious throughout the whole pseudo-pandemic that anyone that questioned the official narrative was either ridiculed, marginalised, censored, shut down. In some cases, you might suspect they may have even been assassinated if we were talking about Magufuli or someone like that.
Yeah.
So, and it was the infodemic was coined by, it wasn't coined by, but it was certainly a central focus of the World Health Organization. A speech that was given by Ghebreyesus, something we might go on to discuss at Munich. He was absolutely focused on that, and I think he actually said that the infodemic was as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than COVID-19. Right. So what they were talking about was information, and they just do not. They want a single version of the truth, which is propagated through this hierarchical structure, and that single version of the truth must not be challenged. And some of the people who have been challenged it, who have been lumped into this idea of being misinformation or disinformation people, are some of the most eminent scientists in the world. So these are people who are at the very, very top of their field in virology, immunology, epidemiology. These are some of the leading figures in those fields, and they've been called conspiracy theorists or anti-vaxxers, or and I think the thing that epitomises the infodemic that the World Health, as the World Health Organization see it, is the mantra of "we are led by science."
Right. Yeah.
Because one thing that the government have not been is led by science. Yeah. They've ignored science.
Yeah. They've cherry-picked certain scientists who really are not. They're not open-minded to other science. Let's say. They're All right. Now I've gone through your book in chronological order. So you make a point in the first chapter about President Trump, and I remember when this happened that a lot of people were quite enthused by this. That Trump had stopped all of the US's funding to the World Health Organization, and they thought that was perhaps going to turn the situation round. But you point out in your book that at the same time, that same US government gave 1.16 billion to Gavi, which is controlled by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Yeah. So they took the money away from the World Health Organization with one hand, and then they gave it to Gavi in the other. Is that what?
Yeah.
So is that? Can you make a comment about Trump then? Do you think that Trump was not trying to oppose it, or?
I think. Going back to what we were saying earlier about no one could get to the top of a tree unless they were an informed influencer.
Right.
But there are some exceptions.
Right.
I think Trump may have been a bit of a spanner in the works. I think he probably wasn't meant to get to where he was. I think the election went not as they were anticipated. He TV personality and all that. He made the most of that. But I think once he was in office, and the thing that I would say is that anyone that does get into high office, like Trump, who then may be at risk of doing something which is against the agenda. He can't do anything. It's not like, it's not like he can actually make any changes that are going to affect anything.
Right.
And that's a classic example. Trump makes the big media statement about withdrawing the voluntary contribution to the World Health Organization. But on the other hand, his administration has actually increased it by.
Right. So that might have been done out of his view, do you think?
Possibly. Yeah.
Right. All right. Yeah. So you say that Bill Gates' wealth increased by 10 billion in 2020. So there's a financial incentive for him with the vaccination programs. And you say that the World Health Organization act as a policy vehicle for a small handful of powerful interest groups who exploit public health policy to advance their own agenda.
Yeah.
All right. You use the term biosecurity state. What does that mean?
It's a fundamental change of the relationship between, for want of a better expression, the people and the government. So if we look at public health protection, our traditional view of public health protection is that the government protect our health by policy initiatives which are designed to protect our health. In the biosecurity state, that is flipped on its head. It becomes the responsibility of the citizen to follow public health policy. Now, to a certain extent, that's always been true. You don't drive your car without your seatbelt on. That is, you could argue that is public health policy. You don't, flush oil down the drain. That kind of thing. But this is far more onerous. So this is the testing. This is the surveillance. This is the track and trace. This is all that kind of behaviour that we have had to adopt in order to meet the requirements of public health policy. So, of course, it's a government policy, so that's subject to change. Right. So once we start, and I think that's a big part of the pseudo-pandemic has been to get us to become accustomed to doing that. Right. So then in the future, as policy changes, we will be accustomed to behaving ourselves, jumping through hoops, at the request of the government. And that is, obviously looking towards the future, those policies could change considerably.
And part of the mind control is to make the people believe that they are the biosecurity hazard, that you are a hazard, because you might pass something on to someone else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you become. I mean, if we think about that, if the whole idea about us being well, so like you and I are sitting here today, I feel fine. I don't know about you.
Yep.
Yep. But in the biosecurity state, because we don't know, because we're not, we haven't had our test this morning, or we haven't had our test this afternoon, we have to consider ourselves to be potential biohazards. So I'm a potential risk to you, you're a potential risk to me. We are all potentially a risk to each other. So what does that mean? That strains our relationship. That makes us wary of each other. That makes it's a fundamental shift in our society, and that has been foisted upon us on the back of extremely questionable science and extremely questionable public policy.
Yeah, it's terrible. Now, in March 2020, it was announced by a group of government scientists, a panel, that they were going to downgrade the threat of this alleged COVID-19. So now I reported on that in show number 286. You've mentioned it in your book. Can you explain the significance of that, Ian?
Yeah, so it was Public Health England jointly with the Advisory Committee on Dangerous Pathogens, which is ACDP. They unanimously, and I think that's significant, they unanimously decided, because by then, we were talking about the 19th of March. So by then there was a lot of data that had come out of China and Italy. So they were able to look at the epidemiology of the disease and were able to predict accurately the kind of impact that the disease would have. They decided that it was not a high consequence disease, and the reason they gave for that was low mortality. So they did not consider COVID-19 to be an existential threat. They absolutely did not. They considered it to be a low mortality disease that primarily affected older people, sadly, but to be clear, they were not saying that this is a lethal existential threat to humanity.
Okay. And do you think that because of that, this means that the state ignored its own constitution and sidelined democracy?
Yeah.
All right.
Driving up today, listening to the radio, what we've got currently is they're talking about a tremendous number of cases. Currently, the UK is far, far away the most heavily tested country in the world. We are, per capita, we are testing on a scale unlike any other country. So testing leads to more cases, because they're not cases, they're positive RT-PCR tests, which is a test for a virus, not a disease. There's a fundamental difference between having a virus and having a disease. So, if I have varicella, I may get chickenpox, or I may get shingles. But just having the virus, which we have theoretically, which we have trillions of in our microbiomes, doesn't mean that we're going to be ill. And when the virus was first theoretically isolated or sequenced, actually, when it was first sequenced, the researchers in Wuhan made that clear. They actually said in their paper, we don't know that this virus is in sufficient quantities to make anyone ill. Okay. So there's a big difference between being positive for a virus and developing the symptoms of a disease. They're two entirely completely separate things. So what they're doing at the moment, when I was driving up today, they're talking about incredibly high case numbers because they've been doing incredible amount of testing. They're then saying, because they've got this, it's also the summer. So in the summertime, we've got very low respiratory virus, very low respiratory illness because it's the summer. You wouldn't expect a lot of people to be dying of respiratory illness in hospital in the summer. So they're saying that because we've got this high number of cases which aren't cases, but very low hospitalisation and mortality. Therefore, that proves that vaccines work. It just doesn't. It just absolutely does not prove that at all.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Now, some people would question the science of sequencing. We're not really here to discuss that.
Yeah.
So let's mention now the 2009 attempted pandemic, because you think this nearly happened in 2009, do you?
Yeah.
Now that's when they changed their definition. I'll just read out the two definitions. So before 2009, the definition of a pandemic was, this comes from the World Health Organization, is it? This is the WHO's definition of a pandemic before 2009 was, an influenza pandemic occurs when a new influenza virus appears, resulting in several simultaneous epidemics worldwide with enormous numbers of deaths and illness. So that's the definition before. So now the current definition is, an influenza pandemic occurs when a new influenza virus emerges and spreads around the world, and most people do not have immunity. So there's no mention there of any illness or suffering.
No.
Is there? So you've said here in your book, by redefining the problem in terms of immunity rather than disease or suffering, the solution then becomes vaccines.
Yeah.
All right. So even if there's no illness at all, we still have a big problem.
Yeah. When the World Health Organization declared the H1N1 flu pandemic, the parliamentarists, PACE, they're called, quickly identified that what they were saying about the pandemic in terms of numbers and infection rates and all that kind, the WHO were giving the impression that this was a lethal global disease, as they have done with COVID-19, didn't match the reality. And that was based on models by Imperial College London. So it was based on the same modelling as COVID-19 has been based upon. So PACE investigated it. And at the time, I don't know whether this was part of the investigation, but it certainly fed into the report, or elements of it fed into the report. The British Medical Journal and the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, they looked at how that decision was come to. Now, there was a body within the World Health Organization called the European Working Group on Influenza. They were key in their declaration of the pandemic. Well, the Working Group on Influenza, they were riven with people with commercial interests with the pharmaceutical corporations, in particular Roche. Now, Roche they sold Tamiflu, which was the antiviral that was supposedly going to be used for treatment of H1N1 influenza pandemic. Well, governments had been buying this stuff by the ton, off the back of what the World Health Organization said, and their decision was driven by this body who had a clear conflict of financial interest. So then, when PACE investigated, they highlighted that. They highlighted a lack of communication. I mean, the WHO was supposed to be a global health surveillance body and the world leaders in public health. They declined to give information. They were evasive about their responses. PACE took them to task about that change definition that we mentioned earlier, and they offered the most bizarre defence. They said, oh well, it's not really a definition, although it was called on their website. It was on their website for years, a definition. So you know, it was a very strange response from the World Health Organization. But I think the key thing that came out of the report that PACE, and it was a damning report that PACE put out about how the World Health Organization had conducted itself, is that what they'd done was produce, and I quote, unjustified scares and fears about health risks faced by the European public at large.
Right. So you think then that the reason why they've been able to do it now is because the core conspirators presumably have taken to task PACE or put their own flunkies in PACE, or you know, why hasn't that happened now?
Well, I don't know, and then you could well be right. I mean, that's something very interesting to look at, actually.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I mean, I think one of the reasons that it's happened again. I mean, you would think if this organisation has got this form, that if they'd said it again, somebody might go, hang on a minute, so at least somebody in authority might do that.
Well, it's like Ferguson, isn't it? They keep using him again and again and again.
Well, he was key in the 2000. It was his same modelling team that modelled the H1N1. I mean, they said that this was going to be a global pandemic. This is what Ferguson's model said.
Yeah.
So Ferguson's model predicted millions of deaths. In the end, I think total confirmed cases of H1N1 flu, so mortality, globally, 18,500.
Crazy, isn't it?
Which is not even a bad flu season.
Right. You mentioned that there was a lot of eminent people who were completely against what was happening, and so this gave rise to the Great Barrington Declaration. Can you explain what that was, Ian?
The Great Barrington Declaration was a group of, again, quite prominent, eminent doctors and scientists who challenged the government's idea of lockdowns and mass quarantine for managing a pandemic. They favoured, something that the government themselves mentioned early on, the herd immunity approach. But the reason that they did was, and this was very much misrepresented in the media, the reason they did was not because that was twofold. Firstly, that they recognised the importance of building immunity amongst the healthy. So the people that are well, out and about in the community, the quicker they build immunity to the disease naturally, the less chance the vulnerable have of getting it. So what they were suggesting was that the vulnerable should be quarantined, should be isolated, so the elderly in care homes and the vulnerable people in hospital and so forth, and give the healthy an opportunity to expose themselves to what is to them a very, very, very low risk virus. So they build up immunity, which means that then you would be able to allow the sick and the vulnerable people out of quarantine sooner. That's what they were suggesting.
Right.
So you could debate whether that was true, sensible or not. But that was it. That's what they were suggesting.
But this was countered by mainstream media. So so how did that come about? They didn't report it correctly. What the Great Barrington Declaration was saying. Is that right?
Well, no. I mean, they just completely. I mean, one of the things that happened was Google just de-indexed it. They took it off their search results. Right. So people that it was signed by thousands. There were I can't remember the numbers, but significant numbers of people. So you got significant numbers of doctors, significant numbers of scientists signed it. Huge numbers of the public signed it, and at that point, Google took it off the index. They de-indexed it. They put it on page 500 or whatever, 200. So no one could sign it. I mean, most people. I mean, how do most people know about these things now? It's the internet. So if they searched for it, they wouldn't have found it. Right. They removed it.
Right.
So that is absolute 100% corporate censorship.
Right. Yeah. So we'll talk about the PCR test now, because you talk about that. You say that their so-called positive PCR test results were misreported as COVID-19 cases, allowing the pseudo-pandemic case numbers to climb whenever testing was increased. The intention was to convince the public that a barely perceptible public health risk was an existential threat to humanity. The World Economic Forum were among many within the GPPP who persistently asserted that PCR tests were capable of identifying COVID-19. And you'd say that's completely junk science. Yeah. This was the epitome of disinformation. A PCR test could not diagnose a case of COVID-19. They were ably assisted in this deceit by the mainstream media, who continually claimed tests were cases. This was disinformation and propaganda operation on a global scale.
Yeah. But the virus is not the same as the disease. So these are two completely different things. They are, of course, related. If you believe in virology, they're related. So potentially so if you've got something like an RT-PCR test, which there are so many variables that go into whether it's accurate or not. The SAGE themselves put the mean false positive rate at about 2.3%. Well, that's 2.3% of all tests. So if you look at the government statistic at the moment, it's about 2.3% of all tests is what they're calling the case numbers. So according to SAGE, most of them could be false positives. So there are many variables like the cycle threshold, the number of cycles that they run the PCR cycle through, the use of what they call primers and probes as to whether they're accurate or not, a standardised system for doing testing. None of these things have happened. None of these things have been put into place. But the important point is it's a test for the presence of a virus. It doesn't say that you've got a virus in sufficient viral load to make you ill or anything like that.
Well, it's a presence. Sorry, just to interject. It's a test for the presence of certain sequences of DNA.
Yeah, no, quite right. Yeah.
All right, let's come on to lockdown, because you think that there may be, or that there is an ulterior motive for lockdown, perhaps a financial one, but I'll just read some more from your book. Lockdown appears to be a deliberate policy with predetermined goals unrelated to public health, not a rational response to a viral respiratory disease. Lockdowns, in brackets suppression, were designed to make the population suffer and to increase mortality. They heightened fears and contributed to the desired economic, social and political destruction, a motive we will discuss later. They also accustomed the people to their behavioural commitment to the new biosecurity state, which you mentioned earlier. And there are lots of quotes in your book showing that lockdowns are completely pointless and do not work. The concept of flattening the curve, etc., reported case rates were always false. There is no scientific basis for asymptomatic spread, even if you believe contagion theory. So do you want to just tell us, so the motive for the lockdown was to change people's behaviours?
I think there were a number of uses that the lockdowns were used for, that it was exploited as a policy, very much to accustom us to extraordinary behaviour. When the philosopher Giorgio Agamben spoke about what the biosecurity state is, he spoke about a society that is perpetually in a state of extremism. So an extraordinary set of circumstances at all times. Well, lockdown is an extraordinary circumstance that just goes on and on and on and on and on and on. The idea being that it would be stop the spread of a respiratory, and an important point about here is an airborne, supposedly, an airborne respiratory virus. And they just absolutely flipped epidemiology on its head. I mean, nobody had ever suggested this before. In fact, the World Health Organization in 2019 put out a document, Non-Pharmaceutical Interventions. So this is the World Health Organization months before the pseudo-pandemic was declared. And in it, they discussed lockdowns and mass quarantine. They ruled these things out because they said about lockdowns, mass quarantine, it's not recommended because there's no obvious rationale for this measure. Epidemiology was absolutely clear about this, especially if you've got potentially an airborne virus. The harm caused by the lockdown, in terms of economic harm, because there's a clear link between economic inequality and deprivation and ill health. So in terms of incubating the virus, because it was also well known that if you put people in close proximity in a confined area, i.e. lock them up in their home, that is the worst possible place for viral transmission.
Yeah. If you agree with If you agree with, you agree. Contagion theory.
Yeah, contagion
and it is a
theory.
Yeah, okay.
But I mean, I think that's another. You make a very good point there. To what extent do the people that are making these policy decisions agree with that theory?
Yeah.
Because I think, I mean, I certainly, when I was writing the book, I was aware of, you know, this is the official science.
Yeah.
And I think, and this is the official science has been presented to us to justify policy.
Yeah.
However, even if you look at the official science, they have, you know,
refuted that lockdowns don't work.
They've absolutely turned it on its head.
Yeah. Now, you say here, those policies were steamrolled onto the population in an act of willful economic sabotage. This was purposefully designed for the Great Reset, which we'll come on to, and global order. So you think that was another motive for the lockdown? It's an economic motive, which we'll talk about. I just want to mention Belarus, because you wrote about that in some detail in your book, because there were a number of countries which didn't implement lockdown, and since then there's countries that haven't implemented the vaccine program, and we can talk about what's happened to those countries. So just Belarus first, Ian, can you just tell us what happened there? Just tell us a little bit about Belarus and what subsequently happened.
Yeah, so I mean, at the start, Belarus, the Prime Minister of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, said that the IMF had tried to bribe him to impose lockdowns. Now, I think it's fair to say Lukashenko was under quite a lot of domestic political pressure, so you know it's difficult to know how much he was playing to his audience, you know. But nonetheless, the IMF then basically confirmed what he said. Yeah. So the quote he says, so Jerry Rice said, Belarus approached the fund with a request to discuss possible emergency assistance. We did not demand quarantine, isolation, lockdown, but we sought assurances for steps to contain the pandemic in line with WHO recommendations, which are demand quarantine, isolation and lockdown, which is our standard operating procedure in all countries, so just the same.
Right. So he's agreeing that money was available if he implemented lockdown.
Yeah, so they offered them $940 million if they did what they wanted. Now, the point is, Belarus, so if you look at this from a health perspective, you've got a population in Belarus, the Belarusians, whose government have decided that they're not going to implement lockdowns. So this is a public health decision. So at the same time, supposedly, we have a global pandemic. So the IMF, so presumably Belarus with this alleged airborne virus. So Belarus presumably have faced the same risks as anybody else. The people in the Belarusians are still at risk from this disease, if you believe the official story. So the IMF offer them money for policies, not for health, for specific set of policies. They choose not to adopt those policies, and they take the money away. So it's the people in Belarus are still ill or potentially going to be ill, but they don't care about that.
So there doesn't seem to be any genuine intention to address the problem with the money. Right. And so do you think that gives us a window into what happened with most other countries then, that haven't made public declarations as he did?
Yeah, I mean, I think the IMF, I think they call it their financial assistance and debt service relief. So it was the COVID-19 financial assistance and debt service relief, which the IMF offered to a number of developing nations to implement policies. So they've got a specific set of, I mean, they say they don't. They say, oh no, we're simply implementing World Health Organization recommendations. But that is policy. That boils down to policy. So you know, it's conditional. So if it was a genuine health concern and you wanted to ensure that the people that were living in those nations had the best possible chance of resisting a disease, regardless of what policy the government, why would you not offer the aid? It's aid. So why would you not offer that aid?